The morning my wife's grandmother drove a borrowed flatbed truck down the county road with 4 oxen on it was a Tuesday in late March of 1987, and the sky was the color of old pewter, low and featureless, the kind of sky that sits on the treetops and doesn't move for 3 days. The ground was still half frozen, that particular in-between condition where the surface gives a little under your boot, but firm clay sits an inch below, and the pasture grass was the color of a grocery bag that had been rained on and dried out and rained on again. She was 61 years old that morning, had been farming the same 112 acres in the hill and hollow country of the upper watershed since 1949, and she had, in the weeks before, purchased 4 draft oxen from a man 3 counties over who was selling out his last working pair and 2 younger animals he had been training and no longer saw a future for, all 4 of them for a combined price of $420, which in the spring of 1987 was still a fair sum for a widow farming without hired help, and which by the going consensus of nearly everyone she knew was either a waste or a sign of something slipping. Her name was Cora, and I want you to understand from the first sentence that nothing about her was slipping. I married her granddaughter 17 years after that Tuesday morning, and I never met Cora alive, but I have walked every foot of those 112 acres. I have read every word she wrote down in the notebooks she kept, and I have seen with my own eyes what those 4 oxen helped her find. So I am going to tell you this story the way it deserves to be told, which is slowly and from the beginning, and without skipping the parts that seem like detours, because on a farm, nothing is a detour. Cora's nearest neighbor was a man named by his family and known to the county as someone who had run the adjoining 400 acres since his father stepped back in 1971. He drove a truck that never seemed to accumulate dust, which in that part of the country is a thing you notice. He came to the fence line within 2 days of Cora bringing the oxen home, leaned on a post with the engine still running, and watched the animals stand in the lower field for a time before he said anything. When he did speak, he was not unkind. He asked her what she intended to do with 4 draft animals on a farm that had not used working animals in 30 years. She told him she was farming. He nodded at that the way a man nods when he has already made a decision but doesn't want to appear to have made it. He said the ground down in the bottoms was too wet for anything but watching it sit, that the east field had not produced a worth talking about yield since the middle of the previous decade, and that the creek, the one that ran or was supposed to run along the lower boundary of her land before it turned and crossed his, had been dry since before the war, by which he meant a war that had ended 42 years prior, and that no amount of work animals was going to change any of those 3 facts. He said all of this without raising his voice, pleasantly, the way a man states things he believes to be structural realities rather than opinions. Then he drove on. By noon the same day, Cora's neighbor at the feed store had heard a version of the story, and that version had grown an extra pair of oxen and a disputed price, which is how those things go. I want to be honest about something before I go further. I came to this story late, the way a person comes to a piece of ground they didn't earn, but intend to steward. My wife, whose name is June, inherited the farm in 2004 when her mother passed, and June inherited it without debt, without dispute, and with the condition that the notebook stayed with the land, which was a condition Cora had written into a handwritten codicil that the family lawyer called unusual but binding. June brought me out to the farm the first full autumn we were together, 2006, and showed me the lower field, the bottoms, the line of second-growth sycamore and cottonwood that marked where the creek ran, and she showed me the notebooks. There were 11 of them in a cedar chest in the back of the equipment barn, marbled composition books with soft corners and covers that had gone wavy from changes in humidity over the years, filled with Cora's handwriting in pencil that had faded in places to the color of the wood ash she sometimes used in the garden. I looked at them that first night under the single bare bulb that hung from the barn rafter on a cord, and I put them back because I wasn't ready. I will own that. I put them back, and it would be 3 more years before I sat down and read them through, start to finish, with the patience they required. And what I found when I finally did is the reason we are having this conversation. Cora had kept the notebook since 1951, 2 years after she and her husband Harold came to the farm. Harold died in 1967, a cardiac event between the second cutting of hay and the third, on a day in August that Cora recorded in the 6th notebook, with a single line, and then resumed her field notes 2 pages later, which tells you something about her that I have always found more moving than anything sentimental she might have written instead. Harold had been the one with the formal agricultural training, 2 years at the state land grant school before family circumstance brought him back, and the early notebooks have his hand in them as well, narrower and more upright than Cora's, appearing in margin notes and on the back pages of the first 3 books with calculations and observations that, reading them now, show a man who was paying a particular kind of attention to the drainage patterns of the land. Harold had noted, in a back-page entry that appeared to date from the spring of 1954, that the east field showed ponding in the northeast quadrant after any rain exceeding 1.5 inches, that this ponding persisted for periods inconsistent with normal percolation rates in that soil type, and that the dry creek bed along the southern boundary showed, in at least 2 locations he had marked with iron stakes, subsoil moisture readings significantly higher than the surrounding upland, which suggested to him the possibility of subsurface flow that the surface profile had interrupted at some historical point. He had drawn a rough map. The map showed the 2 stake locations, a rough estimate of the drainage gradient of the lower field, and at the bottom of the map, in a circle he had drawn twice as if to make it emphatic, a note that read, "Check the old tile if it was ever laid." Below that, a question mark, nothing else. Harold was dead 13 years later, and whatever he had meant to check, he had not checked. Cora had read that note. I know she read it because in her own hand, in pencil, undated but placed contextually sometime in the late 1970s, based on the surrounding entries, she had written beside it, asked at the co-op, no record. Then, a year or 2 further on, estimated by context, asked H's cousin, he thought maybe. Then, in what appeared to be a later hand still, firmer, the pencil pressed harder into the paper. Find out. 3 words, not a plan yet, a direction. She was a woman who wrote things down when she was ready to mean them, and find out written that way meant she had decided. The Oxen arrived, as best I can reconstruct the timeline, approximately 14 months after that last notation. I do not think that is a coincidence. Now, a person not familiar with draft animals and working ground might ask why oxen. It is a fair question, and the extension agent who came out in May of that year, 2 months after the oxen arrived, asked a version of it. He was a young man with a clipboard and clean canvas work pants, and he had driven out in a white truck with the State University seal on the door to discuss Cora's application for a small conservation cost share program for pasture improvement. And while he was walking the field with her, he looked at the oxen working the far end of the bottom ground, and he asked her, with genuine curiosity rather than mockery, whether she understood that the equipment rental co-op in town had a drainage tile plow that could do in 2 days what a team of animals would take all season to approach. Cora told him she understood. He wrote something on his clipboard. He told her that, based on his office's assessment, the east field and the lower bottoms had a combined rehabilitation potential that was, and I am borrowing the word June remembers her grandmother using when she recounted this conversation, modest. He cited the drainage impediment, the historic low productivity of the northeast quadrant, going back to their earliest yield records, and the watershed condition of the creek bed corridor, which his office assessed as a reclaimed dry drainage, that had lost its recharge sources upstream and was unlikely to return to seasonal flow regardless of land management at the parcel level. He was polite, precise, and, in the way of a man with a clipboard full of other people's assessments, entirely certain. He drove away before lunch. Cora went back to work. What Cora was doing with the oxen was not what the extension agent imagined, and not what the neighbor at the fence line imagined. She was not attempting to replicate a tile plow. She was doing something older and more specific. Her grandfather, who had broken the original ground on an adjacent parcel 2 ridges over, before that land passed out of the family, had used working cattle in wet ground conditions, not primarily for tillage, but for what Cora, in the notebooks, calls reading work, by which she meant the deliberate and patient use of heavy animals across a drainage problem to locate, by their behavior and their feet, the lines of subsurface resistance and subsurface softness that no tile plow operator looking at a map could find because they had never been mapped. A working ox on soft ground is not a machine. It is a large, heavy, attentive animal that registers the difference between consolidated hardpan and a zone of subsurface saturation with every step, that will, if you know how to read it, pause, shift its weight, choose a line, and tell you, without language, where the water is. Cora's grandfather had written about this in a letter she had kept folded in the back of the first notebook, and Cora had, over the years of keeping her own notes, added observations that extended and sharpened what he had described. She was not guessing. She was applying a method. The method required patience, a willingness to follow the animals, rather than direct them within a certain tolerance, careful mapping of where they clustered and where they moved quickly, and time. It required time above everything else. She worked the lower field and the bottoms through that spring and into summer, and the animals found what Harold had suspected 33 years earlier. There was tile, not a complete system, not a designed drainage installation of the kind a professional would have laid, but a partial run of clay tile that someone, at some point well before Harold and Cora came to the farm, had put in along what would have been the natural drainage gradient of the northeast quadrant, and then, for reasons no one living could explain, had either stopped laying before the run reached the outlet, or had connected to an outlet that had subsequently been blocked or collapsed. The oxen found it by behavior. Cora mapped the behavioral pattern over 6 weeks of systematic work, identified a corridor roughly 40 feet wide running 220 feet from the northeast corner of the field toward the creek bed, and in the 3rd week of July, with a tile spade she had sharpened herself, she dug at 3 locations along that corridor, and at the 2nd location, at a depth of 26 inches, the spade turned up a clay tile in 2 pieces, both intact enough to show the bore and the joint, sitting exactly on the gradient Harold had estimated from the 1954 ponding observations. The tile was there, never finished, never connected. Sitting in the ground for what she estimated, based on the clay composition and the style of the tile itself, to be somewhere between 60 and 90 years. She did not call the extension agent. She did not call the neighbor. She called a retired county drainage engineer named by the community as a man who had laid and pulled more tile than any 3 other men in the watershed combined, who had been retired for 8 years by then, and who drove out on a Thursday afternoon in a truck considerably older and considerably dustier than the neighbors, looked at what Cora had found, got down on one knee in the dirt, and examined the tile in the 3rd hole for a long time without speaking, measured the gradient with a level he carried in his coat pocket, paced the corridor she had mapped from the northeast corner to the creek bed, and then stood at the approximate location of the outlet end and looked at the creek bed for another long silence. When he finally spoke, he said one word. He said, "Substantial." Then he said that if the outlet had been blocked rather than unbuilt, and if the blockage was findable and clearable, and if the upper end of the run could be extended by another 80 feet to capture the full drainage area of the northeast quadrant, she was looking at a drainage correction that would change the productivity of that field in a way that the maps did not predict. He said he had not seen a tile find made without mechanized survey equipment in a very long time, and he did not know how she had done it. She showed him the map she had made from the Oxen's movement pattern. He looked at it for a while. He didn't say anything else about how she had done it. The outlet was blocked. It took Cora and the retired engineer 2 days to find it, a collapsed junction about 15 feet from the creek bank, where the tile had met an older, smaller bore of a different clay composition that had crushed under the weight of a tree root system. The root ball was from a cottonwood that had come down, by the ring count of the stump still visible nearby, sometime in the mid-1940s. The tree fell, the root mass shifted, the junction crushed, and the tile backed up behind it. The creek, for its part, had been dry since before the war, because the tile that should have been carrying subsurface drainage from the upper field had not been doing so, and the subsurface moisture that would have maintained the base flow of the creek had instead been dispersing laterally into the surrounding clay and holding in the northeast quadrant, as the persistent ponding problem Harold had noted in 1954. The system was simple. The damage was accidental and mechanical. The solution was labor and time, and knowing where to dig. They cleared the blockage in the second day's afternoon. Cora wrote in the notebook that evening, water moved at 4:15. The creek ran again by September of that year. Not strongly, not the way a creek runs after a rain event, but with the steady, modest, continuous flow of a drainage system functioning as it was built to function. A thin thread of water over the gravel bed that had been dry since 1944 or thereabouts, moving quietly along the lower boundary of those 112 acres and crossing, as it had once done, onto the neighbor's land. The neighbor came to the fence line in October. He stood there for a time looking at the water in the creek bed. He said, and June, who was 13 years old that fall and standing behind her grandmother's left shoulder, remembers the exact words, "That's not as dry as it was." Cora said no, it wasn't. The neighbor looked at it a moment longer, then said he supposed there was more going on down in the bottoms than he had figured, and Cora said she supposed there was, and he drove on. That was the whole of it, no ceremony, no extended acknowledgement. A man updating a belief he had held for 40 years in as few words as a man like that was going to use. The east field, the northeast quadrant in particular, changed over the following 3 seasons in the way that drained ground changes, which is not dramatically or all at once, but incrementally, the compaction working out of the soil column as the subsurface water found its path and the plant roots found the depths they had been unable to reach. By 1990, Cora was cutting that field for hay at a yield that the extension agent's office, had they revisited their modest assessment, would not have recognized as belonging to the same parcel. She never called them. She extended the tile run in the spring of 1989 by 90 feet, doing the work herself with a rented trencher and the guidance of the retired engineer, who came out twice that season without being asked, and once brought a young colleague of his who wanted to see the original tile and the behavioral map Cora had made, and who went very quiet when she explained the method, the way a person goes quiet when they encounter a thing that works, and that they were never taught. She charged them nothing for their time. She fed them lunch. I want to stop here and tell you what I found in the 11th notebook, the last one Cora completed before her health required her to stop farming actively in 1998. Near the end of it, in the careful pencil hand she had kept all those years, she had written a paragraph that I have read more times than I can count, and that I will read to you now as close to word for word as my memory of it allows, because it is the reason I am sitting here telling you this story rather than some other story. She wrote, "Harold put a question mark after the tile because he didn't have the time yet to answer it. A question mark in a notebook is not an ending. It is a thing left ready for whoever comes next, with enough patience to carry it forward. The land does not forget what it was built to do. It waits. Everything I have learned about this ground I learned by watching something slower and heavier than myself move across it without hurrying. You cannot read ground by moving faster than it wants you to. When she was done writing that, she left the rest of the page blank, and on the next page she had resumed her planting records for the spring of 1998, which was the last planting season she worked herself, in the same tone and the same hand, as if she had said what she needed to say, and there was nothing left to do but write down what the field intended to grow. Now I want to tell you about the spring of 2009, because that is when I finally sat down with those 11 notebooks end to end. And that is when this story stopped being June's grandmother's story and started being mine to carry as well. We had been on the farm together for 3 years by then. I had been farming June's ground alongside my own leased acres to the north, and I had been watching the creek, which still ran, still moved that thin, steady thread of water it had been moving since September of 1987, and I had been watching the lower field in the bottoms where the oxen had worked, and where the ground still showed, if you knew to look, the faint parallel tracks of heavy animals moving in a methodical pattern across the wet spring soil 2 decades before I arrived. I read the notebooks over 4 evenings in the equipment barn under that same bare bulb on its cord, and when I got to Harold's 1954 back page notes and the map with the circle and the question mark, I sat with it for a while. Then I read Cora's added notations in the margin, asked at the co-op, no record. Asked H's cousin, he thought maybe, find out. Then the oxen arrived 14 months later. Then she found the tile by reading animals the way her grandfather had taught her to read them. Then the water ran. It was the clearest example I've ever seen of a person inheriting a question and deciding, without announcement, to become the person who answered it. What Harold had started and Cora had finished was a drainage correction that cost, when you add the purchase price of the 4 oxen, the labor of the retired engineer across his 2 advisory visits, the rental of the trencher in 1989, and the materials for the 90-foot tile extension, a total that June estimates from the receipts in the cedar chest at somewhere just under $1,800 across a 3-year period. The increase in annual hay yield from the east field alone, starting in 1990, represents a return on that investment that required no accountant to calculate, and that I will not pretend to express precisely because Cora never tried to express it that way herself, and I do not think she would have wanted me to. What she wrote in the notebook was, "The field is doing what it was built to do." That was the number she was interested in, the oxen themselves. I should finish their story. Cora worked the original 4 animals until the 2 older ones were retired in 1991, at which point she sold them to a heritage farm organization 2 states over that was reconstructing working animal programs for educational purposes. And she kept the 2 younger ones, who by then were well trained and steady, until 1994, when a young man from a neighboring county who had been coming out on Saturdays to learn the work purchased both of them for $800, which was exactly twice the proportional share of the $420 purchase price Cora had paid 7 years earlier, $210 apiece being the original reckoning, and $400 apiece the final one. She noted the transaction in the 10th notebook with the date, the price, and the buyer's name, and then added a single sentence, "He will know how to listen to them." I have thought about that sentence a great deal. It is the kind of thing a person writes when they understand that what they are passing on is not an animal, but a method, and that the method only works if the person receiving it knows what kind of attention is required. I want to talk now about what I think this story is actually about, because I do not think it is primarily about drainage tile or oxen or a dry creek that ran again. Those are the facts of it, and the facts are worth knowing, but the facts are the container, and not the thing inside the container. Harold looked at a field in 1954 and saw a problem he did not have the time to solve, and he wrote it down as a question. He could have written it down as a statement as a complaint, as a limitation, but he wrote it as a question, because a question is a thing that stays open. A question in a notebook is an act of faith that someone will come after you who is capable of caring about what you cared about. Cora found that question 13 years after Harold died, and spent, by my count from the notebook chronology, approximately 22 years moving toward an answer by a route that no equipment catalog described and no extension agent had a form for. She used animals that moved slowly over wet ground and told her, in the only language available to them, where the water wanted to go. She dug where they told her. She found what Harold had suspected. She cleared the obstruction. She waited. The water ran. There is a thing Cora wrote in the fourth notebook sometime in the mid-1960s in a context that appeared to be about a different problem entirely, a question about a pasture fence line and whether to move it or repair it, but which reads now as something more general than that particular decision. She wrote, "The difference between a problem and a lesson is whether you were paying attention when it showed itself." I have tried to apply that to everything I do on this ground and on my own leased acres to the north, and I will tell you that I do not always succeed, because patience is not a natural condition for a person working against weather and market and calendar all at once, and because the instinct to solve a thing quickly with the available equipment is a strong instinct and not always wrong. But I think about Cora walking behind those 4 oxen in the bottom ground on a Tuesday morning in the spring of 1987 with a notebook in her coat pocket and a tile spade in the equipment barn and a question her dead husband had left her in a marbled composition book. And I think about the fact that she did not once in all the years of those notebooks express impatience about the time it took. And I think, that is the kind of farmer I want to be accountable to. She did not know I was coming. She left the notebooks anyway. June asked me once, in the second or third year we were on the farm together, why I kept going back to the notebooks, not as a criticism, genuinely curious, the way June asks things. I told her I was trying to learn the farm. She asked me what was in them that I couldn't learn by walking the ground myself. I thought about it. I told her that walking the ground taught me what the farm was now, and the notebooks taught me what questions the farm was still waiting to answer. She didn't say anything for a moment. Then she said, "Grandma would have liked you." I took that as the highest available assessment, and I have not required any other since. We have not run oxen on this ground. I want to be honest about that. I have considered it, read about it, looked into it more than once, and what has stopped me each time is not skepticism about the method, but the honest acknowledgement that I do not yet have the knowledge to use them correctly, and I am not willing to use a tool I do not understand well enough to let it teach me what it knows. That is perhaps the deepest thing Cora's notebooks taught me, and it is this: the method is not transferable as a technique. It is only transferable as an orientation. The orientation is, go slowly enough that the thing you are trying to understand can tell you something. Work at the pace of what you are working with, not at the pace of your own anxiety about the outcome. Follow what moves carefully toward the thing it needs and map where it goes, and trust that the map is telling you something true. The creek still runs. It ran through the drought of 2012, when the pastures in that county went brittle and the cattle tanks dropped, and half the seasonal streams in the watershed gave out by July. It ran thin that summer, thinner than Cora would have liked to see it, but it ran. The retired engineer who had helped Cora clear the blockage died in 1999, but his former colleague, the young man who had come out that spring day in 1989 and gone quiet over the behavioral map, is now in his late 60s and still takes calls, and he drove out the summer of 2012 to look at the creek in the drought and told me the flow suggested the subsurface recharge area was holding up well, which he said, with the particular restraint of a man who does not overstate, was not what he would have expected from a parcel of this size and this history. I did not show him the behavioral map. It is in the cedar chest with the notebooks, and I am careful about what I take out of that chest and what I leave in it. Some things are for the people who earned them to share, and I am the custodian of those notebooks, not their author. What I will share is this, and it is what I want you to take away from this story, if you take away anything. Harold wrote a question in 1954. He put a circle around it and a question mark after it, and then he died without answering it. Cora found the question in the 1970s and spent the next 2 decades accumulating the conditions under which she could answer it, including 4 oxen purchased for $420 from a man 3 counties over who was selling out and had no idea what work those animals were going to do. The neighbors said the creek had been dry since the war. The extension agent said the field's rehabilitation potential was modest. The question mark in Harold's notebook said, "We do not yet know." Cora decided that "we do not yet know" was an invitation, not a conclusion, and she followed the invitation all the way to 26 inches below the surface of a field that everybody with a clipboard had already written the final word on. The tile was there. The water was there. It had been there the whole time. It was waiting for a person willing to move at the pace required to find it. If you have a piece of ground with a question under it, I would like to hear about it in the comments. I do not mean that lightly. I mean the kind of question that was written down by someone before you and left in a box or a drawer or a conversation you half remember. The kind of question that your neighbor with the clean truck thinks was settled years ago and that you have not been able to let go of. Those questions are not failures of resolution. They are invitations waiting for the right combination of patience and attention and the willingness to follow something slow and heavy across wet ground until it tells you where to dig. The field does not forget what it was built to do. It waits. If this story meant something to you, I would be grateful if you subscribed. We move slow on this channel, but we get there.